When you're a kid living in the United States, you're introduced to the American Revolution at a very early age. It's the same in every nation, I suppose, to have all kinds of fun events dedicated to the birth of your country. Parades, games, block parties, and of course, illegal fireworks.
Celebrate the independence of your nation by blowing up a small part of it.
All right.
It goes deeper than the day your country was founded, though. As a kid, I can't really think of a year where we didn't learn and relearn about the American Revolution in some way or another. Singing patriotic ditties from yesteryear, learning about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The American indoctrination train starts early and doesn't let up, I tell ya.
And now, the stars of Four Kids.
No, God, no, stop, not even for a joke. If you're familiar with this channel, you'll know I've made some of my grievances with this fair nation of ours and its history apparent. But it would be disingenuous of me to state that the American Revolution isn't one of my favorite periods of history to learn and talk about. I remember as a kid being absolutely fascinated with this history, and really enjoying learning about key moments like the Boston Tea Party, the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Yorktown, among the many other influential events and people that made the revolution possible. And with all the media surrounding the time period, like the Schoolhouse Rock songs they'd play in classes, or the sentimental favorite Liberty's Kids airing on PBS.
Give us black dick and we fear nothing.
I was constantly made aware of the near-mythic figures and events in the birth of the US, through a very simplified, watered-down lens palpable for young, impressionable minds like yours truly. This simplified, watered-down version of history doesn't necessarily stop once you've hit a certain age, though. Most of the media that depicts the revolutionary period features fairly simple takes that, while mostly historically accurate, do have various tweaks and shifts for the sake of a better story. America's past is hardly the only one viewed with this amount of creative license. But in recent years, there's been a bit of a pushback as we've started to come more to terms with the muddied, hypocritical history that makes up the Revolution and the birth of America. And of course, when I say we, I mean people who aren't afraid of basic critical analysis. Last year's release of the film version of the incredibly popular Broadway musical Hamilton reopened a lot of the debate that was present when the show premiered in 2015, but was somewhat quieter in comparison to 2020. The debate on whether or not it was right to depict the Founding Fathers, the majority of whom were white and predominantly slave owners, as people of color, and that if viewing them through a modern lens and presenting this history through contemporary hip-hop and rap was not so much recontextualizing the Founding Fathers as it was glorifying them. I mean, there is something to be said about how someone like George Washington is treated with the utmost of reverence in the show, but his own personal history with slavery is only lightly touched upon.
I raise funds in D.C. for the Washington Monument. Tells my story. I speak out against slavery. You could have done so much more.
Not to mention his participation in early Native American genocide, well, not being mentioned.
We've been receiving reports of Allied natives working with the British. I've asked my men to put a stop to it.
By burning their villages and salting the land, by calling for their extermination, according to this letter. Not the first time, either.
There's a multitude of historical inaccuracies and omissions in Hamilton that smarter people than me have talked about and tried to rationalize in the overall discourse surrounding the show. However, the overall quality of Hamilton isn't what we're here for today. No, today I thought I'd discuss the simplification, glorification, and mythology of the birth of America, using a somewhat more obscure reference point. Or at least, obscure to the 72% of people who voted in this poll I posted a while back. What, I didn't say it was professionally peer-reviewed.
I have come to the conclusion that one useless man is called a disgrace, that two are called a law firm, and that three or more become a Congress. And by God, I have had this Congress.
1776 is a musical centered around the days leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It premiered on Broadway in 1969, and was adapted into a movie in 1972, featuring many of the same actors from the original show. The show's focal character is future second President John Adams, an obnoxious and disliked lawyer from Boston, whose efforts to introduce a vote on independence have met with failure. Though there are those in Congress who share in his desire to break free from Britain's yoke. Much of the conflict in the show comes from many of Adams' fellow delegates, who are less enthusiastic to officially separate themselves from England, be they for financial or personal reasons. While the musical received praise when it premiered, even winning 3 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, the movie was met with a much more lukewarm reception, with contemporary critics calling the songs unmemorable and the acting too cartoonish. Said one Roger Ebert in his review for the Chicago Tribune, "This is an insult to the real men who were Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, and the rest." Do you like my Roger Ebert impression? "But then we've emasculated our founding fathers in story and song for so long that they're practically a set of caricatures. By the time 1776 came along, the stage was set for a dumb, simplistic romp through Independence Hall. I guess we don't want to fully recognize the stature of those early leaders. Might make the present variety look a little transparent." Jeez, Roger, who hurt you? Still, the musical and the movie aren't without their fans, including Lin-Manuel Miranda, who has spoken favorably on the influence 1776 had on Hamilton.
Sit down, John, you fat mother!
As for me, I stumbled onto this movie by complete happenstance around 10 years ago during a 4th of July celebration at an aunt's house. The TV was on for ambience, and no one was really paying attention to it. But the very concept of a musical about the Founding Fathers was just abstract enough for me at the time that it caught my interest regardless. You have to understand, this was long before most of the public even knew Hamilton was a thing. So even a bunch of older white guys in powdered wigs singing about whether they should open some windows or not was an interesting concept to someone like me.
Someone ought to open up a window!
Oh, shut up!
I listened to some of the songs, read the synopsis, and around the next few 4th of Julys, I would catch it on the Turner Classic Movies channel. And I've made it a semi-tradition to try and watch it every year since. Is that because it's particularly good? Well, it has its moments.
A whole week! The entire Earth was created in a week.
Someday, you must tell me how you did it.
I'd be lying if I said I thought it had the same kind of universal appeal as Hamilton, though. The songs are serviceable and catchy, but probably won't leave drastic impressions to those who don't watch it every year. And the structure is downright baffling compared to other musicals. I haven't seen the musical performed in a theater, to be fair, but in the movie at least, there's a whole 40 minutes that go by without a single song. Seriously, we get 3 in the beginning in pretty quick succession, and then nearly an hour watching a pretty down-to-earth reenactment on what the Continental Congress meetings might have looked like. Most of the research done into said meetings was based on second or first-hand accounts years later, or pure speculation on the writer's part, since they kept no records back then for obvious reasons.
But there's no backing out now, for if we do not hang together, we shall most assuredly hang separately.
So from that angle alone, it's pretty interesting. But this is a musical after all. You kind of expect a decent ratio of songs to talking scenes. You know, I'm almost curious what would happen if you showed these 40 minutes to a room full of people without telling them this was a musical. Well, it's a little slow so far, but I do enjoy the performances and the dedication to historical accuracy. Wait, why are they singing?
I say you should write it.
Still, I'm not gonna act all high and mighty and pretend I don't like it. The rapport between the members of Congress is pretty hilarious, and the acting is solid all around. It's hard to imagine people who could better look the parts of some of these iconic historical figures than Howard Da Silva as Franklin, Ken Howard as Jefferson, and of course, William Daniels as John Adams, although most people might know him better as...
Fine! Fine! Ow! Hey, what?
I've had the idea to talk about 1776 for some time, but wasn't quite sure what angle to approach it from. Not that you necessarily need an angle to talk about something.
Right, what's your angle?
I don't know. Yeah, whose face are we shoving this musical
You don't shove a musical in someone's face. What are you talking about?
But with all the talk on some of Hamilton's shortcomings last year, and its depiction of these historical figures, I wanted to approach its older, much whiter cousin with sort of the same lens. Because there is a lot to say about the treatment of the Founding Fathers in this show, and how it seeks to portray them in a modern, or at least modern as it was back in the late 60s to early 70s, sense. And most of this comes not from treating them with the amount of reverence that a lot of media surrounding the revolution did and still does, but in treating them more as a bunch of excitable frat boys. And, in a way, this is kind of what gives 1776 its charm. There seems to be an almost prerequisite in American politics that one can't discuss or dictate policy without first consulting the age-old question, What would the Founding Fathers think of this?
What would President Obama read? If he read this, what would he learn?
I think he would learn that the founding principles need to be applied today, and we have the ability to fix our problems, but the further we stray from the founding principles, the worse it gets.
Yes, no matter how far removed we get from the late 18th century, no matter how much time has passed or how much society has progressed from the age of powdered wigs and travel by horse-drawn carriages, there's a certain sect of people who will always go back to the intent of the Founding Fathers in regards to the projection of our fair country. Never mind that if any one of these men were here today, their heads would probably explode if they could see some of the shit we consider commonplace. We also have the impossible task of interpreting what exactly they intended the country to be like some 200 years past their expiration dates. But of course, the Founding Fathers weren't just ordinary men, you see. They were visionaries, the most brilliant men of their time, ordained by the Big G himself to grant us freedom from the tyranny of oppression. Or at least, that's what modern parlance seems to regard them as most of the time in American discussion. Ironically, through its heavier emphasis on exaggerated comedy taken almost directly from the stage, 1776 features a much more nuanced take on the mythological figures of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and many of their peers. When recalling his collaboration with Sherman Edwards on making the book for 1776, playwright Peter Stone said, "The minute you heard 'Sit down, John,' you knew what the whole show was. You knew immediately that John Adams and the others were not going to be treated as gods or cardboard characters, chopping down cherry trees and flying kites with strings and keys on them. It had this very affectionate familiarity. It wasn't reverential." And that's probably the biggest thing I noticed myself when I rewatched the movie recently, and is probably best represented in the show's depiction of George Washington.
G. Washington.
It's not uncommon for even the more accurate portrayals of Washington to play up his image in history. Hamilton, again, is a notable example, but even Liberty's Kids, which tended to focus a lot more on the messier side of the war, didn't really bring up any of the character flaws, for lack of a better term, that the general had. And while 1776 does hold him to some level of decorum,
Virginia, the land that gave us our glorious commander-in-chief, George Washington.
it offsets this by having every letter of correspondence between him and the Congress be absolutely morose.
My quartermaster has no food, no arms, no ammunition, and my troops are in a state of near mutiny. I pray God some relief arrives before the Armada, but fear it will not.
That man would depress a hyena.
He makes no secret to them that the Continental Army are woefully ill-suited to battle against the greatest empire in the world, at the time, and frequently laments his position as general.
Oh, how I wish I had never seen the Continental Army. I would have done better to retire to the back country and to live in a wigwam.
Most of the drama leading up to Congress's vote on independence is riddled with the same kind of personal melodrama. It's not that Thomas Jefferson's writer's block was the result of fear to putting to words an entire people's consternation and desire for freedom and equal rights. It's that he really wanted to get nasty with his wife and couldn't think of anything else. John Adams' desire to introduce a vote on independence is agreed on by at least half of the members of Congress. It's just that he's so annoying to the majority of them that they'd rather hear it from anybody else, and so on and so forth. Much like Hamilton or any number of dramatic reenactments of history, though, most of these personal conflicts are either exaggerated or entirely made up. But not, I wouldn't say, in some malicious scheme to make these men feel more human than they really were. I mean, they were human, with their own personal lives and desires. And putting more emphasis on human drama over complete historical accuracy isn't always a bad thing. You just have to recognize the intent behind it, and whether it was blatantly trying to erase the past, or was just for the purpose of a better story. Even if it paints some of these men in a much harsher light than they probably deserve. But we'll get to that later. It's pretty obvious the only reason the show included the characters of Abigail Adams and Martha Jefferson is because otherwise the cast is kind of a huge sausage fest. But their inclusion also adds a layer to Adams' character that you probably wouldn't get were they excised from the show entirely. The real-life correspondence Adams and his wife had are relegated to imaginary dialogues between the two that allow Adams to be vulnerable with someone and reflect the relationship they had in real life, with Abigail inspiring him at some of his lowest moments and being more than a match for his stubbornness.
Peter.
Pins.
Peter.
Pins.
Peter.
Pins.
Peter.
Pins.
Done, madam, done.
Done, John. Hurry home, John.
It's time for your flattening. And while you could argue that Martha's role in the musical is somewhat superfluous, it's her reunion with her husband that reminds John of what he's given up in his pursuit of independence. He may claim that life is more than sexual combustibility, but it's not like he's a robot. Or, an artificially intelligent car.
I am the voice of Night Industry 2000's microprocessor, KITT for easy reference.
Oh, what? I had to. He misses his wife the same way anyone would miss their partner were they in a long-distance relationship. The same way I missed my partner whenever we would have to be apart for months on end while we dated long distance. It's really the scenes in Congress that seek to show a much more realistic take on these men, however. And since the majority of the movie takes place at Independence Hall, we get ample time to familiarize ourselves with them. They bicker about petty topics, take the piss out of each other, and down rum by the bottle before it's even lunchtime.
It's a medicinal fact that rum gets a man's heart started in the morning.
Far from the saintly gentlemen portrayed in pictures depicting the Continental Congress, these men are very quick to come to squabbles, and even to blows in one instance.
Madman, landlord, lawyer.
However, when it comes to the debate of independence and the main argument against it, this is where the musical starts to deviate the most from history in the name of a more dramatic story. And the man who probably received the blunt of this was this guy, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. In the show, Dickinson is pretty much Adams' main rival, utilizing every tactic he can to delay or quash the vote on independence, and pretty much being the face of the continental conservative right, along with this guy, Edward Rutledge. Except, in real life, while Dickinson was opposed to the Declaration of Independence, it was mainly because of his own religious beliefs. Whoops. Yeah, something 1776 completely omits is that the real John Dickinson was a huge Quaker. No, not that kind of Quaker. Well, kind of? Oh, never mind. You don't really hear a lot of Western Christians self-identify as Quaker nowadays. But there are more than 300,000 Quakers around the world today, and many don't even identify as Christian. Regardless, one of the core tenements to the Quaker ideology is a staunch belief in nonviolence, which put Dickinson in a difficult position in regards to the Revolution. He was also concerned that the result of the Revolution would be a repeat of the English Civil War, which resulted in a highly puritanical rule by Oliver Cromwell. Aha, we meet again, Danny DeVito.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang! Bang! Well, I don't see so good, so I missed.
This makes his depiction as the main obstacle on the path to the Declaration's signing a bit odd. As far as politics in the 18th century were concerned, this guy was pretty progressive for his day, even more progressive than a number of his peers in Congress. Quakers in general were among the first groups to call for the abolition of slavery not long after the Revolutionary War concluded. And Dickinson even freed all of his slaves in 1777. He still had slaves in the first place, but given the time period, it's way more than you'd expect from someone like him. This also calls into question just how chummy he would really be with Edward Rutledge, the secondary antagonist of the show, and the biggest proponent of removing Jefferson's passage against slavery in the original draft of the Declaration. He even gets a whole song about it.
Molasses to rum to slaves. Oh, what a beautiful waltz.
Given that the real Rutledge was from the deep South, South Carolina to be precise, it's doubtless that he was probably up to his tits in slaves. But it's not like he was very unique in that position. A lot of his fellow delegates from the North, even Benjamin Franklin, owned slaves themselves. With John Adams being one of the only founding fathers and the only early president, along with his son, to not own slaves at any point in his life.
Like a mouse!
The show has a scene where Rutledge and the entire South walk out and threaten the vote for independence, unless the anti-slavery clause is removed. Something that sends Adams into his darkest hour, with him and Franklin going back and forth on preserving or removing it.
It's a luxury we can't afford.
A luxury?
The gist of Rutledge's song, Molasses to Rum, is the equivalent of an extended "No you" argument where he claims that the North is just as complicit in the triangle trade of slavery as the South. To which, even if it wasn't specifically Rutledge who would argue this in real life, he has a point about. Thomas Jefferson later recalled the clause's removal, saying, "The clause 2, reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of..." What the hell, Jefferson? The clause 2, reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa, was struck out in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people had very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. It's interesting that 1776 attributes this quote to Rutledge in the beginning of his song, albeit slightly paraphrased, while Jefferson's own sordid and hypocritical history with his slaves is only briefly mentioned in another moment of whataboutism from Rutledge.
I have already resolved to release my slaves.
Sure, Jan.
Am I implying that there was some malicious intent in casting most of the South, and those who disagreed with voting for independence, as the villains in this show? Not necessarily, but I do find it interesting that the really popular founding fathers like Jefferson and Franklin aren't really called to task for their complacency in slavery, while someone lesser known like Dickinson is called out for things that he didn't even do in real life. And this is mostly the pratfalls that reenactments of history often fall into. The idea that there has to be a straightforward conflict between right and wrong. If there is no real villain or conflict, or there's otherwise substantially less than what would make for interesting entertainment, then it's often completely exaggerated or fabricated. This is honestly one of my own complaints with something like Hamilton, which featured an emotional affair between Alexander and his sister-in-law, Angelica, where no such relationship existed in reality. But again, this comes from a desire to have more recognizable conflict and stakes for a modern audience, even down to calling Dickinson, Rutledge, and the rest of the Southern delegates as right-leaning men.
To the right, ever to the right, never to the left, forever to the right.
When what we would define as the political right or left wasn't even a thing back then. Not to say that left or right ideologies didn't exist, just that they weren't explicitly called left or right. But the allegory was necessary to create a term that modern audiences could immediately understand, if all the other posturing from these cool, considerate men didn't make the allegory obvious enough.
But don't forget that most men with nothing would rather protect the possibility of becoming rich than face the reality of being poor.
It's interesting that when this movie was coming out, the song that Dickinson and his Dello Delegates perform was actually removed from the theatrical cut, at the behest of one President Richard M. Nixon, who happened to be close friends with the movie's producer, Jack L. Warner. Apparently, when the original Broadway team performed the show at the White House after they won the Tony for Best Musical, they were advised to excise the song from Nixon's staff, too. While they didn't back down during this performance, Mr. Warner was less dedicated to sticking it to his old bosom buddy Tricky Dick, and cut the part out himself, even ordering the negative to be destroyed for some reason.
How'd you like to try and borrow $1 from one of them?
Among the other numbers Nixon's staff requested cut was the song immediately following Cool, Cool, Considerate Men, about a shell-shocked courier relating to some of the Congress's custodial staff about the last words he heard a friend say on the battlefield.
Mama, hey mama, come looking for me.
It's not entirely unsurprising that Nixon might take offense to Mama Look Sharp, as, given the country was knee-deep into the Vietnam War, its placement immediately after the song about the right-leaning politicians' willful ignorance to the death and carnage of war was most likely trying to convey something beyond just the horrors of the revolution. And that's probably the biggest thing to consider when these major reenactments of American history come out. How does this historical period of time reflect our own modern history? How did the forming of our nation contrast to the terrible realization of what our policing of the world really entailed? What did Hamilton have to say about our views of politics during the tail end of the Obama presidency, and the descent into Trumpism just a year later? How effective are we at dispelling the myths of the Founding Fathers, and the greater American mythology in our modernization of their struggles? Do we end up creating relatable people that were complicated figures living in a time where we couldn't really expect much else from them?
Besides, What will posterity think we were? Demigods? We're men, no more, no less, trying to get a nation started against greater odds than a more generous God would have allowed.
Or are we just making up excuses for their inaction against some of the greater hypocrisies they were all guilty of, that many of us are still guilty of ignoring? Not long before quarantine went into full effect last year, it was announced that a revival of 1776 would be coming to Broadway in 2021, with a majority woman cast of multiple races, obviously riding off the colorblind casting of Hamilton, and retroactively addressing the severe lack of a female presence in the original show. And while I'm very curious to see how this cast and crew will adapt to the show, I can already imagine that much of the same discourse surrounding Hamilton's colorblind cast playing slave-owning white men will be repeated for this revival, and rightfully so. It is difficult to come to terms with the idea that these iconic figures of American history could be as flawed and hypocritical as many modern-day politicians, when many who grew up in America were raised on this deeply sanitized version that is still repeated by full-grown adults who should really know better by this point.
Franklin smote the ground, and out sprang George Washington, fully grown and on his horse.
I like it.
There's no easy answer when it comes to making peace with history, because pretty much the entirety of human history is filled with contradictions. Messy, ugly, horrifying contradictions. And maybe the best thing we can do is stop trying to answer the age-old question of what our founding fathers would do in such and such situation, and look more to the future. Use the musings and anecdotes of our past to better learn about ourselves, and try to be better because of it. I mean, when you really think about it, the average 5-year-old child with their parents' cell phone is privy to more information than any of the founding fathers had in their entire lifetimes. So do we foster that 5-year-old with the belief in American ideals that even the founding fathers never lived up to? Or do we actively pursue these beliefs ourselves, and hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, all races, all genders, all people are created equal? And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering why I didn't put this out on July 4th, there's some debate as to whether or not the Declaration was even signed on July 4th, so...
Shut up!